Thank you for joining us. This is Chris White, National Correspondent for Crux, and I'm here with Caitlin Morneau of the Catholic Mobilizing Network, who serves as the Director of Restorative Justice. Caitlin, good to be with you.
Great to be with you too, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Now, we're going to have a chat about restorative justice and why Catholics should care about it. But let's start by first sort of defining our terms. What is restorative justice, and how does it connect with the Catholic faith?
Yeah, so I'm happy to share with you kind of Catholic Mobilizing Network's general description that we tend to use, but I find that sometimes it's helpful to have kind of an image in mind. So I want to share briefly a story of a case that I had the opportunity to be a part of that kind of represents like sometimes your typical example of restorative justice. So there was a young person and his friend who it was a cold day. They were kind of playing around in a parking lot, and the ice on the cars had gotten really really solid. So they were kind of tossing ice around at each other. One piece of ice went over the wall and hit a car that was driving by, broke the windshield, and really upset the driver. So because they were near a mall, the security was called, and the young person was charged with a misdemeanor. So fortunately, in this jurisdiction, there's an opportunity for a restorative process to take place. So a dialogue was brought together with this young person, his family, and some of their support people, as well as the person whose car was hit, and a trained facilitator who they had a conversation about, what happened, how were we all impacted, and what do we need to do to make this right. So they decided on, they talked about those questions, decided on some community service and paying the deductible on the car insurance and a couple of other things to kind of move forward in a good and positive way, that fortunately also avoided for this young person having a record, and that going on his having a police report. So that's an example of a restorative practice. Restorative justice is really a philosophy. It's a way of understanding crime and harm more generally in terms of the people and relationships that were impacted, rather than the law that was broken. So our criminal justice system tends to ask the questions of what law was broken, who's guilty, and what should their punishment be. Whereas restorative justice asks, what was the harm, who was impacted, and how do we move forward in a good way, trying to make things right. So you heard an example of what might be called a victim offender dialogue or community conference, kind of depending on where you are. Another typical restorative practice is also referred to in different ways, but generally called circle process, peacemaking circles, that are really deeply rooted in Indigenous traditions, actually, but kind of bring folks together, pass a talking piece, and gives everyone the opportunity to share or reflect on a question or an issue at hand together. These practices are applicable, again, in cases of harm and conflict, but also more generally to promote community building, learning, prayer, and reflection in communal ways. So in terms of, what does this have to do with Catholic teaching? We often talk about restorative justice being based on principles and values, and those principles and values are really consistent with our Catholic faith. It's all centered around human dignity, and what do when a harm happens, how do we honor that human dignity? By recognizing that there are needs that need to be met. And so how do we come together as a community, as one body of Christ, to address those needs? It sees justice as being first and foremost about living in right relationship with one another. And I loved how the recent pastoral letter against racism really, named and reminded us of that really clearly. And then other values that we kind of think about and talk about are the option for the poor and vulnerable. That really, this restorative justice starts by thinking about the victim, the persons who were harmed, and from there, including others who were involved in the incident, as well as upholding accountability and taking responsibility for what happened, along with healing and hope and transformation and those things that are so core to us as Catholics. I think the other thing that really stands out to me is that Pope Francis keeps reminding us that we need to create a culture of encounter. And these practices, in addition to the philosophy, really offer very practical ways to enter into that culture of encounter in any community that we're a part of.
Now, for 10 years, the Catholic Mobilizing Network has been working against to bring about an end to the death penalty. And you have a newly released faith formation guide that I see right behind you, Harm, Healing, and Human Dignity. Can you tell me a bit about this guide and how it also differs from other sort of books or resources out there on restorative justice?
Sure, I'm happy to. We're so excited about this resource. I also have another one next to me. You can see it on the screen there. So yeah, Harm, Healing, and Human Dignity, a Catholic Encounter with Restorative Justice. And I should just say that this is actually an adapted resource from our first restorative justice book that came out, both published by the Liturgical Press. Redemption and Restoration, there we go, was published in 2017 in collaboration with Mount St. Mary's University. And Redemption and Restoration is a really in-depth theological, practical analysis of restorative justice and as it's applied in our criminal justice system, as well as other facets of life, schools, etc. And so Catholic Mobilizing Network, as we see kind of interest and curiosity about this topic grow and talk with folks all around the country, they were really, what we heard was a desire for something a little more introductory. That was going to be kind of a quick read, and that when folks wanted to go deeper, they could do that with Redemption Restoration and any number of other resources that also exist around restorative justice. And I guess just to backtrack, just to say thank you for acknowledging we're thrilled to be coming up on our 10-year anniversary. And while most people know us for our anti-death penalty work, that this ethic of restorative justice has always been central to who we are and how we engage in this work, particularly in involving individuals who have lost loved ones to murder in our own kind of organization and process and approach to this work. So it's really a blessing to get to expand on even further on, what is this thing called restorative justice and how can Catholics be involved? And so really we wanted both these books, particularly Harm, Healing, and Human Dignity, to kind of, plant that seed, build that bridge for folks who had heard about the term and were thinking about, how does this relate to my faith? And what are opportunities to put this into practice within my own Catholic parish or community or ministry. And so I'm trying to think, we wanted it to be, again, introductory and reflective, for there to kind of be, I think it's really easy for us to, easy but also difficult and overwhelming to think about the sheer expanse of the brokenness of our criminal justice system and injustice in so many ways that we face right now in our country and in our world. And so we also wanted to honor that impacts us personally and individually. And sometimes these punitive mindsets around, punishment and finding out who's guilty, that can get in the way of just everyday relationships. And so we really wanted to create a resource that got folks thinking about, how does this apply in our criminal justice system, but also how does this apply in my everyday life? So it seeks to kind of integrate those questions throughout. We intentionally included lots of stories of folks who have been personally involved in a restorative justice process and what were their experiences like, as well as Catholic ministries and individuals who have started initiatives in their communities, kind of what those have looked like. We've included there's an online reader guide that accompanies the book with videos, tools, prayers, and reflection questions, particularly for groups. And, it really seeks to be relevant to the challenges today, particularly, I think, as more and more Catholic communities and parishes are looking for ways to address, what comes to mind is around issues of racism and clergy sexual abuse that we're facing in the church, that folks are looking for ways to respond and approach these injustices that uphold human dignity and accountability, as well as creating spaces for healing. And restorative justice and practices really offer an opportunity for that. So I think, and I think to answer your question around, what makes this different, I think that, like I said, there are a lot of resources out there, and I think what folks were looking for was really a way to kind of enter into this, this term, this idea, these practices, and think about how they're related to who we are as Catholics, and see the ways that this big idea, this social movement that's growing across the country, that it applies to us too, and we all have a role to play in that.
So just finally here, as Catholics engage in reading this book, whether it be an individual or a group, what are you hoping sort of the takeaways from this will be?
So first want to acknowledge that we're so thrilled at how many people are already engaging with this book. We know that lots of folks have ordered it and are reading it kind of individually for discernment, as well as in small groups. I've talked to a number of social action and ministry directors who are ordering multiple copies and sharing it with their volunteers. I've heard stories of folks giving it to friends and family members of theirs who work in corrections. I got one great email from a woman who's actually going to be using this on retreat inside of a women's prison. So I just thought that was just incredible. And really, I think that it's, I was thinking about how, it's not a how-to manual, but it's a tool for us to kind of ask ourselves, what is my role in all of this? And I think, if I can highlight one of the stories from the book, one of our dear friends at Catholic Mobilizing Network, Justice Janine Geske, who I think many folks are familiar with what she's been doing in the church around clergy sexual abuse and hosting healing circles in parishes. She also has done a lot of victim offender dialogue inside of prisons. And I think her story is so powerful because it was, is in her process of becoming Catholic that she really started to look at the way that our prison system was operating and seeing the justice within it, and was a skeptic herself initially. But then when she really got to be in circle and relationship with these individuals and see the transformation that happened when really thinking critically about how our actions impact others, that it was transformational for her as well, and very much a part of her own spiritual journey. So I think it's, it's I mentioned earlier about how the fact that we all have a role to play in this transformation, but that, we can all, we all have relationships in our lives that are broken, unfortunately. And for us to stop and say, when have I experienced harm? Or when have I caused harm to someone in my life? And what needs to be done to make that right? What's within my power to do? And I think that's both on an individual basis and on a systemic level, for us to ask ourselves those questions, and really, how can I live in a way that models Jesus's reconciling way, and how can I invite the communities and ministries that I'm a part of to do that as well. So it's really an opportunity for kind of considering next steps, seeing what other folks have done, recognizing that restorative justice is often something that's applied in our increasingly applied in our criminal justice system, but that it's really a way of life, that it's a better way of dealing with and responding to harm and conflict and injustice, and that we can all play a part in that.
Great. Caitlin Morneau of the Catholic Mobilizing Network, author of the newly released Harm, Healing, and Human Dignity. Thank you for talking with us, and congratulations as you all celebrate your 10-year anniversary, upcoming gala in October of this year, I believe. So thank you.
Great, October 10th, World Day Against the Death Penalty.
Absolutely. Thank you, Caitlin.
Thank you so much, Chris.